Today we are going to discuss the threefold of investigation. By the way, I am Rosemar M and I am with 𝐇𝐞𝐥𝐥𝐨
Garbriella Villanueva,
Melvin C. Galang,
Rosemarie Dizon.
Pamintuan Kate,
Mariñas Dominic, Melvin Tayag.
Forensic Files Season 3, Episode 7, Grave Evidence. Let me give you a brief background about this Forensic Files Season 3, Episode 7. Martin Dillon was a very popular man in town, and his father was the local mayor. Martin has a wife named Pat, and they have two young children. Dr. Stephen Sher is a good friend of Martin Dillon. Stephen Sher and Martin Dillon went skeet shooting on a beautiful spring day. Martin was shot dead, but his friend maintained it was a freak accident. It took more than 20 years for the truth to surface. So, this is a short video clip about what really happened to Martin Dillon. So you guys can watch it.
2nd, 1976, Martin Dillon left work early to go skeet shooting at his family's hunting camp, a secluded place called Gunsmoke. His good friend, Dr. Stephen Sher, went along. Stephen Sher was one of the town's doctors and a close personal friend of the Dillons. Martin asked some other friends to go with him that day, but they all had other plans.
And I said, Marty, I can't go out. I said, I got just so much going on, I just can't get away. And I just didn't go.
A few hours later, Martin Dillon lay dead.
Martin Dillon was laying on his back with his arms outstretched. There was clay pigeons under the one arm. The wound itself was dead center into the chest, right into the heart. There was no mistaking that it went straight into the heart.
Dillon.
After the incident and the investigation, Martin Dillon's body was taken to the county morgue in the basement of a funeral home in Montrose. On the death certificate, the coroner, who was political appointee, ruled the manner of death an accident. For Martin Dillon's father, Larry, sadness was overshadowed by suspicion and doubt. He did not believe his only son's death was an accident. A few months after the incident of Martin Dillon, Dr. Stephen Sher divorced his wife, Anne, and a year and a half later, Stephen Sher remarried to Pat Dillon, the widow of his best friend, Martin Dillon. Now, let me discuss how the threefold aim of investigation were achieved in this case. The first threefold aim of investigation is identify the suspect. Dr. Stephen Sher was pled guilty of murder. With depth investigation, it turns out that all the act of execution was fabricated and his late best friend died because of murder. Dr. Sher admitted the day of the killing that there is a affair going between him and Martin Dillon's wife.
The second threefold aim of investigation is to locate the suspect. A decade and past, the investigation of the case is still ongoing. Authorities could no longer ignore the evidence. The next day, Dr. Stephen Sher, together with his wife, Pat, returned to the Pennsylvania to have a news conference. His 21-year-old story then now finally admitting that he had been having an affair with Dillon's wife, Pat. Also admitted that fabricating his porcupine story. The jury convicted that Stephen Sher of a first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. This forensic file, entitled Grave Evidence, was identified in the last years and have been able to solve the problem. The threefold aim of investigation is very important way to resolve the case, where we need a step-by-step procedure to obtain goals.
The third threefold aim of investigation is provide the evidence of his guilt. According to Bennett, he carefully studies the autopsy photos and read the report. He focuses on Dillon's wound, conducted an experiment. He stretched some pigskin to a mannequin and used the same model of 16-gauge shotgun with the same ammunition used in the accident. Dr. Mihalakis performed the autopsy. He discovered that the direction of the wound track was in a downward direction at a 40-degree angle. The shot came from the right of Martin Dillon and went through Dillon's heart and left lung. Authorities could no longer ignore the evidence, and on June 26, 1995, Martin Dillon's death was formally declared a homicide. After watching this forensic file being solved after 2 decades, my reaction is a mix of relief and amazement. The passage of time can often dim the hopes of justice, but witnessing the perseverance and dedication of law enforcement in resolving this case is truly commendable. The way they how the threefold aim of investigation were achieved, it reminds me that no matter how long it takes, the truth will eventually prevail, offering closure to victims and their families. These experiences reinforces my faith in the justice system and serves as a reminder that justice knows no time limits.
The next forensic files that we will discuss is entitled The List Murders, Season 1, Episode 12. Now, let's begin.
This is how art and science led to his capture.
In 1971, John List left a note with the bodies of his mother, wife, and three children in his mansion ballroom before he disappeared. The List family lived in a large Victorian home in the quiet, affluent town of Westfield, New Jersey. He and his wife, Ellen, had been married for almost 20 years. They had 3 children, 16-year-old Patricia, 15-year-old John, and 13-year-old Fred. John List's elderly mother, Alma, also lived with the family in her own separate apartment on the 3rd floor. In this scene, we will locate the suspect. There had been 2 schools of thought. One was that he had committed suicide after committing the homicide, and the other was that he was living somewhere out around the Midwest.
Then, detectives had an idea.
Tonight on America's Most Wanted.
The television show America's Most Wanted has led to the capture of some of the FBI's most celebrated fugitives by generating phone tips from viewers.
The detectives had an idea to do an episode on the John List murders, despite the fact that the case was almost 2 decades old. After the forensic was complete,
On America's Most Wanted.
Now tonight's first case, the oldest we've ever pursued on America's Most Wanted.
On Sunday night, May 21st, 1989, America's Most Wanted aired the episode on the List
From
murders.
this angle, notice
In Denver, Colorado, a family recognized the face of a mass murderer.
if you know anything about John List, call
The night America's Most Wanted revealed the forensic bust of John List, Wanda Flannery and her daughter were
in Denver, Colorado, a family recognized the face of a mass murderer.
about John List. Call
The night America's Most Wanted revealed the forensic bust of John List.
Wanda Flannery and her daughter were watching from their home in Denver, Colorado. Much to their horror, they saw a striking resemblance between John List and the former neighbor.
Adding up gradually that he was an accountant and a Lutheran, and that he had a scar behind his ear, and that he was well put together and a classy dresser. And by the time they got to the sculpture, I was convinced it was him.
To look at it, you would have known.
And the clincher for me was the glasses and the jowls.
We said, oh my God, that's Bob, Bob Clark.
Bob is John List. We've got to call.
Wanda Flannery told the FBI that her former neighbor recently moved to Richmond, Virginia, and was using the name Bob Clark. The FBI closed in, and agents arrested Robert Peter Clark at the accounting office where he worked in Richmond.
Mr. Clark? And he said, yes. And then I said, are you John List? And he says, no, I'm Robert P. Clark.
But Bob Clark had a scar behind his right ear, and a fingerprint check matched prints on a gun permit application John List had filled out 1 month before the murders. Bob Clark and John.
First, we identified the suspect. Nearly 20 years after the brutal murder of his entire family, John List, a 46-year-old accountant, is guilty of 5 counts of degree murder and sentenced him to life in prison, and will be eternally synonymous with concept of selfishness, horror, and evil. He's a man who coldly, calculatingly, and cunningly conceived and carried out a cowardly plan to assassinate each of his 3 children. Frank Bender was accurately in every detail about John List's appearance. Amazingly, the sculpture was exactly the same as John, and even wore the same glass and suit when he was in front of the judge. Frank Bender was a true hero in this case. Finally, Frank Bender brought John List to justice.
Over newspaper articles and photographs to analyze the man behind the murders. They researched his strict upbringing by German parents.
The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want.
The Lutheran Church had been a focus of young John's life. He was an only child and the son of an overly protective, domineering mother.
And based on what I've watched, the List murders, John List killed his wife, mother, and 3 children in their house in New York, Jersey. On November 9, 1971, he left a letter confessing and explaining his motive to his pastor. Then he fled to New York and abandoned his car at the airport. He also assumed a new identity as Robert Clark and moved to different states. He was on the run for 18 years until a forensic sculptor, Frank Bender, created an age progress bust of him based on his old photos. So basically, they add 18 years to his face to look as the recent on what they are searching for. So the bust was featured also on the TV show America's Most Wanted, which led by the citizen to his identification and arrest by the FBI on Virginia at the year of 1989. Then he also convinced of 5 counts for the first-degree murder and sentenced by a life imprisonment.
The last forensic files that we will discuss is Southside Strangler, Season 1, Episode 6.
Reggie Tucker, husband of the victim. Susan Tucker is 44 years old. When the crime happened, Reggie Tucker is out of the country for a business trip. The neighbor noticed that their bedroom window wide open in the cold November weather. So they called the police. When the police entered the house, they saw something wrong. The police saw Susan Tucker. Her body is decomposed. Lying face down on the bed, she had been dead for 45 days. The hands of Susan Tucker is tied behind her, and her feet were tied, and the head is hung over the side of the bedroom. She had been strangled and possibly raped. The killer is genius and careful because he wore gloves and left no fingerprints. It had been raining on the night when murder happened, and he cleaned the area around point of entry. The police collect all the possible evidence, the rope and nuts used to strangle Susan Tucker. The police were convinced that they seen this work before. 3 years earlier, a 34-year-old lawyer named Caroline Ham had been raped also by the same person. But Caroline Ham case closed when 𝗪𝗓𝗪𝗔𝗔𝗓 confessed to a murder and sentenced in 35 years in prison. In less than a month, 2 young women have been raped and strangled in their home just a few blocks from each other. 2 weeks later, he struck again and did the same crime. The nuts were identical ones used in Arlington cases. Detective Horgas suspected that the killer of Susan Tucker was the same man who murdered Caroline Ham and 3 women. The FBI concluded that the suspect is between the age of 18 and 30 years old. Horgas decided to try the new DNA testing, sending the semen stain from Susan Tucker's nightgown to the 𝗪𝗔𝗘𝗪 laboratory in New York. The final results from the DNA tests would take up to 10 weeks. But Detective Horgas still didn't have a suspect. Detective Horgas suspected that the same individuals who raped and murdered Susan Tucker and Caroline Ham 3 years earlier was the masked rapist who committing crimes in the same area but was never caught. Spencer's history unfolded in trouble as a teenager. He had a string of burglary convictions and even more surprising. Just as the FBI predicted, Spencer had first drawn police attention for arson for setting fire to his mother's car. According to the house records, Spencer had been signed out during the Thanksgiving holiday, visiting his mother in Arlington. The week Susan Tucker was murdered, Spencer lived in the area where the first rape was committed. On January 20, 1988, police arrested Timothy Spencer. They collected the DNA samples to Timothy Spencer. When the scientists completed the DNA analysis of the semen stain found at the Susan Tucker crime scene, they made a chilling discovery. Horgas was right all along. The semen samples from the individual who raped and presumably murdered Susan Tucker matched the semen stains from the murders in Richmond. And finally, Timothy Spencer's blood DNA was compared to the semen samples from the victims, and it was matched. On July 11, 1988, Timothy Spencer went on trial for his life. He was sentenced to death with the use of DNA and psychological profiling, helped catch a serial killer and send innocent free.
To the glass particles taken from the broken window at Susan Tucker's home.
We were able to say that that glass that was removed from Spencer's clothing either came from that particular pane or that particular source of glass or another source of glass that had the same optical characteristics.
When scientists completed the DNA analysis of the semen stain found at the Susan Tucker crime scene, they made a chilling discovery.
And I remember pulling out an X-ray film from the developer and holding it up from these 2 separate cases and being bombarded immediately that the patterns I'm seeing are the same. I'm seeing the same profile on this case from one county versus this case from the second county, which says to me that the same person's involved in both of those incidents. It really give you chills up and down your spine to see something like that.
Horgas was right all along. The semen sample from the individual who raped and presumably murdered Susan Tucker matched the semen stains from the murders in Richmond.
There were 7 hairs that were consistent with his. There was a glass fragment that was consistent with his. His family couldn't provide him with a complete alibi for the entire weekend.
And finally, Timothy Spencer's blood DNA was compared to the semen samples from the crime victims.
Once we got a sample from Mr. Spencer to test, we generated a profile that was the same as the profile we got from the evidentiary samples. We had a frequency of occurrence of greater than 1 in a million. So that means that only one person in a million in the population would have that particular genetic profile.
And starting with the first result, the blood type, it was a match, it was a match, it was a match, it was a match.
On July 11, 1988, Timothy Spencer went on trial for his life. It was the first time in the United States where DNA evidence would be used in a...
And so, good morning or good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Dominic Mariñas, and I will be discussing the crime of Timothy Spencer and what he did. So, first of all, the investigator did not have any suspect at the time because they wasn't sure, and they were looking for someone to try to. First, they mistaken the wrong guy for it. Second one, they don't have any solid proof that this guy did it. So the second time that it happened, first they used deductive reasoning. They look for suspects that could do this. First they did is check to the juvenile and who has committed crimes in that area. So the first thing they think of is the criminal is between 18 to 30 years of age, and this criminal is smart but not that smart, that's why he got caught. So first they found out the semen on the nightgown, and they rub it up, and they found a hair, which they found is not the head, hair on the head, which is a pubic hair. So so how did they locate the suspect? Actually, they found this. The investigator remember a name, Timothy Spencer, and they arrested him. So they arrested him. Then they took a blood sample out of him and cross matched this and with this blood and the semen found on the investigation, and they found it that it did match. But at the time in 1987, the DNA testing kit was still very new to the country. So, but they found out that it really works. So how did they find any more evidence to prove it? Yes, they did. They found his clothes, which contained the same glass particles in the house of the victim. They scratched it, and they found that it's the same glass as the one in the house of the victim. So in 1987, Timothy Spencer was the first man executed in the United States based on DNA evidence. So that year was the first year that DNA evidence was proven useful and reliable. So after that, before that they did an inspection background of Timothy Spencer. He did have multiple crimes like setting fire on his mother's car and more, because he has some problems and he is guilty of this crime. So what crime did the sender? He's guilty of capital murder and rape, and that's all. Thank you.